The sound of fingernails scratching on wood is etched into my mind, a ghostly refrain that refuses to fade. Even now, years later, it echoes in the quiet moments, at night when the house is still, and the world outside seems impossibly far away. That night, December 13th, 2020, began as nothing more than another winter evening in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I had no inkling that the warmth of my routine would soon be shattered by an event so unexplainable, so terrifying that it would tether me to a mystery spanning decades. I never believed in signs, but perhaps I should have. The falling snow that night wasn't soft and comforting. It was a silent shroud, covering everything in its heavy white stillness. The cold felt sharper somehow, as though it were seeping into the bones of the town itself. It wasn't the kind of night where evil announces itself with dramatic flair. No, it came quietly, threading through the ordinary with deliberate precision. I haven't spoken about that night for a long time. Even now, I hesitate, as though giving voice to those memories might summon them back. But the reports I've seen, eerily similar incidents in Reading and Allentown, whispering the same unnatural horrors, force my hand. What happened to me isn't isolated. Whatever walked through my door that night is still out there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night to an unshakable feeling that something was wrong, you already know a fraction of what I felt. That heavy, oppressive certainty that you're not alone. It's the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself, but burrows into your skin, settling deep. What I didn't realize then was that my fear wasn't unfounded. It was only the beginning. I had no way of knowing that in a matter of hours, I would come face to face with something that defies explanation, and that what I survived that night would leave a trail, a sinister thread connecting me to others who had brushed against the same nightmare. Whatever it is, it's not done, and neither am I. Lancaster wasn't a place where you expected anything extraordinary to happen. It was a town of predictable rhythms. Early morning joggers on Maple Drive, the gentle hum of lawnmowers in the summer, and the faint smell of wood smoke curling through the air in winter. People in Lancaster lived in harmony with the quiet. It wasn't just a backdrop, but a way of life. Our neighborhood was the kind you might see on the cover of a real estate magazine. A collection of colonial-style homes, each with its manicured lawn and neatly trimmed hedges. The sidewalks were wide, perfect for evening strolls, and the streetlights cast a soft golden glow that felt more like a comforting embrace than a safeguard. It was a place where unlocked doors weren't an invitation to danger, but a statement of trust. At 417 Maple Drive, our home was no different. A white picket fence framed the property, and an old maple tree stood sentinel in the front yard, its branches sprawling like open arms. Inside, the creak of the hardwood floors and the ticking of an antique clock in the hallway were constants, a familiar melody that grounded us in the ordinary. On most days, that ordinary was enough. The neighbors added to the charm. Mrs. Peterson across the street often left her front door unlocked, claiming she'd rather welcome guests than fear strangers. The Hendersons, a retired couple, still hung vintage Christmas lights on their porch every December, creating halos of soft colour in the winter fog. Even Mr. Wilson, who was perpetually fixing something in his garage, contributed to the comforting hum of daily life. That winter, the cold was harsher than usual, and the snow came early, blanketing everything in an unrelenting white. The air was so crisp it seemed to cut through you, and yet even the bitter chill felt predictable. We knew how to brace against it, wrapping ourselves in layers and settling into routines that carried us through the long, dark nights. Looking back, I realize how perfect the quiet was, how it lulled us into believing nothing could go wrong. That sense of safety, that trust in the mundane, was the foundation of our lives. It was also the perfect cover for what was coming. As the snow piled up that December, it didn't feel ominous. It felt insulated, like the world was wrapping itself in silence. I didn't realize then how deceptive that silence could be, or how in a single night it would transform into something oppressive, something unrelenting. The quiet in Lancaster was more than just peaceful. It was blinding. And in its shadows, something was waiting. The taillights of Sarah's car disappeared down Maple Drive, leaving behind an emptiness I hadn't anticipated. The silence seemed to seep into the walls, stretching out until even the ticking of the hallway clock felt louder than usual. She was headed to Pittsburgh for her annual cookie baking weekend with her sister, Emma, a tradition I never dared interfere with. I had waved her off from the driveway, smiling despite the strange hollowness creeping in as the crisp December air bit at my skin. The house was too quiet without her. I told myself it was just the absence of her usual hum, the soft clinking of mugs as she brewed tea, her laughter drifting from the living room as she caught up on her favorite crime shows. Yet something about that night felt heavier, as though the air itself had conspired to press down harder, whispering that her absence was more significant than I knew. I busied myself with routine, folding laundry, clearing the kitchen counters, even flipping through the neighborhood watch app for lack of better distraction. Nothing unusual there, just another lost dog post and a debate over whether the Wilsons' Christmas lights were too bright for the block. It was ordinary, mundane. Exactly what I needed to lull my mind into ease. The weather forecast promised a heavy snowfall by morning, and the first flakes had already begun to fall by the time I locked the doors. Sarah always reminded me to double-check them when she was away, though it felt almost unnecessary in a neighborhood like ours. I followed her instructions anyway, clicking each bolt into place, the sound echoing more than it should have in the stillness. Upstairs, the bedroom felt colder than usual. I adjusted the thermostat to a comfortable 68 degrees, throwing an extra blanket on the bed for good measure. My thoughts wandered as I lay there, trying to settle into the quiet. I thought of Sarah, probably laughing with Emma in her sister's warm kitchen, and how much lighter the house always felt when she was home. I drifted off to the muted sound of snow hitting the windows, thinking of everything and nothing at once. But even then, in those final moments before sleep claimed me, a faint unease lingered at the edge of my thoughts, like a shadow just out of sight. If I had known what was coming, I would have begged Sarah to stay. I would have stood in the driveway, blocking her car's path, defying tradition and reason. But I didn't know. All I felt was the quiet, a quiet that would soon become unbearable. I woke with a jolt, my throat dry as sandpaper, the kind of parched that feels like your body is warning you about something more than thirst. The glowing numbers on my phone read 2:45 a.m., their cold blue light casting eerie shadows across the room. For a moment I stared at them, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. The air around me felt wrong, dense, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Swinging my legs off the bed, I stepped onto the hardwood floor and was immediately struck by the biting chill. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, as if the temperature had plummeted without warning. My body shivered and I glanced at the thermostat's digital display glowing faintly in the hallway. 52 degrees. That didn't make sense. I had set it to 68 before heading to bed, the same routine I'd followed for years. Maybe the heating system had failed, I thought, though deep down, the excuse felt feeble. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, forcing myself to move down the hallway to check the vents. Each step on the creaking floorboards seemed louder than usual, echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. Then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic scratching that sent a ripple of unease up my spine. It wasn't the erratic scrape of tree branches against the window or the harmless rustle of a mouse in the walls. No, this was deliberate, methodical, as if someone or something was dragging fingernails across the surface of my living room walls. I froze, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. My rational mind fought to dismiss it. Maybe the wind had picked up. Maybe the radiator was acting up again. But the sound was too precise, too intentional. As I stood there, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by something even more unsettling. Footsteps. They were slow, measured and unnervingly precise, moving across the living room floor with an ominous deliberation. The sound was unmistakable, the sharp click of dress shoes on hardwood. I knew those floors better than anyone. I'd walked that path countless times, and the steps below mirrored my own movements through the house, almost as if the intruder knew the layout intimately. The footsteps paused. My breath caught as I realized where they'd stopped, at the base of the staircase. The one place where the floorboards always groaned under pressure. I held my breath, listening intently, and I could feel it now, an undeniable presence, something watching, waiting. Then the scratching resumed, but this time it was closer. It started climbing the wall beside the staircase, slow and steady, as if it were crawling upward, dragging itself toward me with a dreadful purpose. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my mind racing through every logical explanation and rejecting each one in turn. Something was in my house, and it wasn't human. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My instinct screamed at me to run, to call for help, but I couldn't move. The only sound was the scratching, getting closer with each passing second, carving into the silence like a knife. Deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The light appeared first, a faint blue-white glow cutting through the shadows downstairs, moving with an unsettling precision. It wasn't the soft golden beam of a flashlight. This light was cold, clinical, casting sharp, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and distort the familiar shapes of my home. From my vantage point at the top of the staircase, I couldn't see its source, only the way it swept across the walls like a predator searching for prey. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the banister, peering through the gaps in the railing. The footsteps resumed, each one punctuated by an agonizing silence in between. The sound was deliberate, as if the intruder wanted me to know they were there. Heel, toe, heel, toe. I gripped my phone tightly, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but I hesitated. What would I even say? There's someone in my house, but I can't explain what's happening. It wasn't just fear holding me back. It was the realization that whatever was moving below wasn't bound by the normal rules of this world. The light stopped at the base of the stairs, pooling like spilled water. And then, faintly at first, I heard the whispering. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The cadence rose and fell like a chant, words twisting together in a way that made my ears ache and my stomach churn. Some voices were high and brittle, like children laughing through clenched teeth. Others were low and guttural, dragging each syllable like a growl. I clung to the wall for support, trying to steady my breathing, but the whispers grew louder, filling the air with their haunting rhythm. They seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides, and yet I knew they were coming from below. The footsteps shifted, moving toward the kitchen. The light followed, painting the walls with its eerie glow. The whispers faded slightly, as if retreating with the movement, but their echo remained in my head, a sinister melody I couldn't shake. Through the haze of fear, I realized something chilling. The intruder knew the house. They didn't hesitate, didn't fumble in the darkness like a stranger might. They moved with confidence, taking the exact path I would to avoid creaky floorboards and uneven rugs. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light went out. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear even the faintest sound, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet, as if the house itself had been swallowed whole. My fingers trembled as I unlocked my phone, but before I could dial, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking dread that they weren't just below me anymore. They were moving. Upstairs. The light flickered back on, this time casting its glow across the top of the staircase. It was closer now, impossibly close, and with it came a new sound, a scraping, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I turned, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. The hallway stretched before me, dark and unwelcoming, but it was my only escape. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, the dragging sound more persistent, as if whatever was chasing me was closing in. I didn't dare look back. The instant the clock hit 3 a.m., the house seemed to exhale all at once, a sharp, unnatural shift that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then, without warning, every electronic device in the house went dead. My phone, which I'd just checked moments earlier and had 85% battery life, blinked off in my hand. The digital thermostat's soft glow vanished, leaving behind a suffocating darkness and a cold that seemed to seep directly into my bones. I stared at my phone, pressing the power button frantically, but the screen remained a lifeless black mirror. The hallway, once illuminated by the faint green numbers of the thermostat, was now plunged into a disorienting void. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was the feeling that something had extinguished the house's very essence, leaving it hollow and foreign. Panic tightened its grip on me as I stumbled toward the nearest outlet, fumbling for a charger. Surely, this was just a power surge, I told myself, a desperate attempt to impose logic on the chaos. But when I plugged in my phone, the charger gave no reassuring hum, no spark of life, nothing. As the seconds dragged on, the silence around me became almost unbearable, interrupted only by the faint sound of my own ragged breathing. Then came the cold. It wasn't the kind of chill you could fix with a blanket or a stronger furnace. This was primal, invasive, as if the air itself had turned against me. My breath condensed in front of me, pale clouds forming and dissipating in the oppressive darkness. The analog thermometer by the bathroom door caught my eye, its needle trembling as it dipped lower and lower. 45 degrees, 40 degrees, 35. Indoors. My mind rebelled against the impossibility of it, but my body couldn't ignore the way the icy air clung to my skin, cutting through layers of fabric as though they weren't there. The world outside seemed just as lifeless. I glanced toward the window, hoping to see a reassuring glow from a neighbor's porch light, but the snow-covered street lay in complete stillness, illuminated only by the faint reflection of the moon. No flickering TVs, no headlights, just a profound, unnatural void. My hand reached for the light switch instinctively, though I already knew it wouldn't work. My fingers fumbled against the cool plastic, flicking it back and forth with increasing desperation. Nothing. It was as if the house had been severed from the grid, cut off from everything but the growing sense of dread closing in around me. Then, in the stillness, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were all around me. The cadence was sharper now, more insistent, as if the voices were pressing against the walls, demanding to be heard. I clutched my dead phone tightly, the useless device now nothing more than a cold weight in my hand. Logic and reason had no place here anymore. Something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong, and whatever it was had no intention of letting me go. The shadows in the hallway shifted, darker than they should have been, and the whispers grew louder. I realized with a jolt of terror that the silence of my dead electronics wasn't random. It was intentional. It was their way of ensuring I had no way out. The first step was deliberate, calculated, as if announcing its arrival. The floorboard groaned under an invisible weight, the sound sharp and invasive in the frozen silence of the house. My pulse quickened as I strained to locate the source, my eyes darting through the suffocating darkness. Another step followed. Then another, each one slower, heavier, more menacing than the last, ascending the staircase with agonizing precision. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow and frantic. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The sound wasn't random, nor was it hesitant. It knew the path. 5th step. 7th step. The 9th, where the faint stain of spilled wine still lingered from Thanksgiving. Whoever or whatever was climbing those stairs wasn't lost. It was coming for me. The whispers followed, low and guttural, layered with higher, brittle tones. They slid through the air, filling the hallway with a chorus of words that weren't meant to be understood. Their cadence was hypnotic, almost rhythmic, rising and falling like a dark hymn that sank deep into my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. A faint light flickered at the bottom of the staircase, its pale glow creeping upward, inch by inch. It wasn't the warm, reassuring glow of a flashlight, but something colder, unnatural, its edges fraying as if it barely belonged in this world. The light danced on the walls, casting shadows that stretched and twisted, elongating into impossible shapes. Then it paused. The footsteps stopped just short of the landing, and the whispers grew louder, converging into a crescendo of unintelligible syllables. My heart hammered against my ribs as the light swayed, almost playful, before freezing in place. The shadows on the walls shifted unnaturally, pulling toward me like a tide retreating before a monstrous wave. I dared not move. My body trembled as I clung to the wall, my mind racing through every logical explanation and rejecting each one. The presence was no longer confined to the stairs. I could feel it, something unseen, tangible in its malice, standing at the threshold between the staircase and the hallway. The air grew colder still, every breath forming pale clouds that lingered unnaturally long. The whispers fractured, some receding into faint echoes while others grew sharp and insistent. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking about me. I edged backward, my bare feet skimming the icy hardwood as I moved toward the office door. The light flickered again, brighter this time, casting a cruel illumination over the family photos lining the hallway. Their faces, once warm and familiar, now seemed distorted, their smiles stretched and eyes hollow, staring back at me with an unnatural focus. Behind me, the door loomed, a sanctuary I wasn't sure would hold. The footsteps resumed, slow and methodical, as the presence followed. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew there was nowhere for me to go. I bolted for the office, my bare feet sliding on the icy hardwood floor as the whispers surged behind me. The door loomed ahead like a lifeline in a storm, its solid frame promising a meager barrier against the encroaching presence. My hand fumbled with the handle, cold and slick beneath my trembling fingers, as the first heavy step landed at the top of the stairs. The whispers grew louder, an oppressive symphony pressing against my ears, but I managed to yank the door open and hurl myself inside. The weight of the room's silence was immediate, almost suffocating, as I slammed the door shut with a force that reverberated through the walls. My hands scrambled to lock it, the small click of the mechanism offering a fleeting sense of security. Then came the scratching. It started softly at first, a deliberate drag of nails against the wood, as if mocking my efforts to keep it out. My heart hammered as I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, but the sound only grew. Not just one set of nails, dozens, maybe hundreds, raked across the surface with an eerie precision. I knew the lock wouldn't hold. The thought struck me like ice water, jolting me into action. My grandfather's oak desk stood in the corner, its massive frame a relic of sturdier times. I rushed toward it, my legs trembling under the weight of adrenaline, and shoved with all my strength. The desk groaned against the floor, its legs scraping loudly as I dragged it toward the door. The scratching intensified. Now it wasn't just nails, but the faint creak of the door handle turning. I froze mid-push, watching in horror as the brass knob twisted slowly, first one way, then the other, as though something on the other side was testing its resistance. The chanting began again, louder this time, a terrible crescendo that made my skin crawl. Shadows slithered under the door, pooling like ink across the floor. They twisted unnaturally, reaching toward me in jerking, spasmodic movements that defied the laws of light. With a final heave, I wedged the desk against the door, its weight pressing into the frame. I stepped back, gasping for air, and stared as the shadows continued to writhe. The chanting seemed to synchronize with the scratching now, each stroke of nails on wood matching the rhythm of the unnatural voices. I reached for my phone, the useless device still clenched in my hand, and tried to turn it on again. Nothing. My thumb jabbed at the buttons in frustration, but the screen remained dark, its emptiness mirroring the gnawing fear in my chest. The door shuddered violently, the wood bowing inward as if under immense pressure. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought it would splinter, the solid oak giving way to whatever waited beyond. But then it stopped. Silence fell abruptly, thick and deafening, as if the entire house was holding its breath. I stood frozen, my back against the far wall, clutching the phone as though it could shield me. The only sound was the erratic pounding of my heart, filling the void left by the absence of whispers and scratching. But I knew better. The silence wasn't a reprieve. It was the beginning of something worse. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the still dark morning, their sharp glare reflecting off the snow-laden street like an alarm no one wanted to answer. I stood on the front porch, clutching a blanket around my shoulders, unable to feel the cold anymore. When the first officer stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen driveway, it felt as though the nightmare might finally have an explanation. But deep down, I knew better. "Are you hurt?" The officer asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of calm reserved for people on the verge of unraveling. I shook my head, unable to form words, and gestured toward the house instead. As they entered, I hung back, watching as two more officers followed, their flashlights carving beams through the unnatural stillness of my home. I wanted to warn them, not about an intruder, but about something far worse, something I couldn't articulate. Yet, I stayed silent. My throat constricted with fear. The first officer's voice called out from the hallway. No signs of forced entry. Of course there weren't. Whatever had been in my house didn't need to break in. I followed hesitantly, the warmth of the blanket doing little to steady my nerves. The living room was untouched, the kitchen exactly as I had left it, and yet the air still carried that oppressive weight, a faint echo of the terror that had gripped it just an hour before. Then we reached the office. One of the officers shone his flashlight across the door, pausing on the deep, jagged scratches that scarred the wood. My stomach twisted as I saw them clearly for the first time, hundreds of marks etched in chaotic patterns as though clawed by countless hands. But what caught my attention more was the handprints. They were everywhere, clustered around the edges of the door, impossibly small but eerily precise. Each one had 5 fingers, yet they were too tiny, too perfect to belong to a child. The officer stepped closer, running his gloved fingers over the grooves, his brow furrowed in confusion. "These look fresh," he muttered, his voice trailing off as though he didn't want to say more. Another officer called me over. "Did you hear anything unusual? See anyone?" I tried to explain, the whispers, the cold, the way the shadows moved, but my words felt hollow, impossible to believe even as I spoke them. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They didn't believe me. Not fully. One officer knelt beside the thermostat, fiddling with its settings. "It's working now," he said, glancing at the display. Temperature's back to normal. Of course it was. Whatever had been here had left, taking its chaos with it, leaving behind only its chilling evidence. The senior officer, Detective James Martinez, arrived shortly after. He was different, quiet but deliberate, his gaze lingering on the scratches and handprints longer than the others. "This isn't the first time I've seen something like this," he said softly, almost to himself. My breath caught. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering, his voice low and grave. "There've been other cases, similar disturbances. Not often, but enough to notice a pattern." Before I could press him further, he turned away, speaking in hushed tones with his team. My mind raced with questions, but the answers felt just out of reach, obscured by the veil of the unexplainable. As the officers filed out, I was left with a lingering dread. The house felt emptier than before, the silence sharper, more deliberate. Whatever had visited wasn't done with me. It had just left its mark. "You're not the first," Detective James Martinez said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the jagged scratches covering my office door. The weight of his words hit harder than I expected, a cold confirmation of something I had feared but hadn't dared to name. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, his gaze shifting to the cluster of impossibly small handprints, their eerie precision highlighted under the harsh beam of his flashlight. "There have been other cases, not here in Lancaster, but close enough. Reading, Allentown, Harrisburg. It's always the same story. Scratches, handprints, inexplicable cold. And it always happens at night between 2 and 4 in the morning." My mind raced as he spoke. The idea that I wasn't alone in this, that others had experienced the same horror, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Why hasn't anyone said anything? Why isn't this public? Martinez shook his head, the wariness in his expression deepening. "People don't talk about these things. They don't want to believe it's real. Or worse, they're too scared to admit it. But I've been tracking these incidents for years. They happen every 13 months, almost like clockwork, and they've been happening since at least 1987. The date struck me like a thunderclap. 1987? I repeated, my voice cracking. "That's as far back as I've been able to trace," he said, his tone heavy with frustration. "The locations change, but it's always in Pennsylvania. Always the same signs. Families too terrified to stay in their homes, reports of whispers and strange lights, clock stopping at exactly 3:33 a.m. and then nothing, no evidence, no suspects, no explanation, just silence." I felt a chill crawl up my spine as his words sank in. "Why 13 months? What happens then?" Martinez hesitated, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's deliberate. Too specific to be random." The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the shadows themselves were listening to our conversation. "You said this has happened to other people. Did anyone figure it out? Find a way to stop it?" His silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say it. There were no answers, no solutions, only the lingering remnants of terror. "What do I do?" I asked finally, desperation creeping into my voice. Martinez looked at me, his expression softening. "For now, you stay vigilant, and you document everything, every detail, no matter how small. If it happens again, I want to know immediately." His words offered little comfort, but they planted a seed of purpose. If this thing wasn't going to stop, I couldn't afford to be passive. I nodded, even as fear tightened its grip on me. Martinez glanced at his watch, his shoulders tensing slightly. "It's almost 4:30. We should clear out before dawn." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "One more thing," he said, his tone darker now. "Don't ignore the texts." A chill washed over me. "The texts?" He nodded. "Every victim I've spoken to eventually starts receiving messages. Empty, untraceable, always from their own number. It's never immediate. It could be days, weeks, even months. But when it starts, you'll know." As he stepped into the hallway, I felt the weight of his warning settle over me. This wasn't just a one-time event. It was the beginning of something far larger. A web of occurrences stretching back decades, each thread anchored by an inexplicable terror. The pattern was clear. The question was, how long would it take before it found me again? The first message came exactly 1 month later at 3:33 a.m. I woke to the soft buzz of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Bleary-eyed and groggy, I reached for it instinctively, expecting an innocuous notification or maybe a late-night weather alert. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sender's name was familiar, too familiar. It was my own number. The screen displayed nothing but a blank message. No subject, no text, no attachment. Just an empty void staring back at me, as though daring me to make sense of it. My first thought was that it had to be a glitch, some bizarre technological hiccup. But the memory of Detective Martinez's warning clawed its way to the forefront of my mind. "Don't ignore the texts." The words echoed in my head as I sat up, my heart pounding against my ribs. I stared at the phone, waiting for some follow-up, a second message, a signal that this was all just a mistake. But the screen remained empty, the silence in the room heavier than it had been moments before. I opened the message, my finger hovering over the screen as though it might bite me back. Nothing happened. No hidden code, no sudden burst of static, just a blank space where meaning should have been, accompanied by the growing realization that this was no ordinary message. Over the next few weeks, the texts came sporadically, always at 3:33 a.m., always from my own number, and always empty. No amount of rationalizing could shake the deep unease they brought. I tried blocking the sender, but the messages still came through, bypassing every attempt to shut them out. The phone company was no help either. When I called to report the issue, the customer service agent assured me that it was impossible. "Messages like that can't be sent without a number in the system," she explained, her voice tinged with the kind of disbelief that made me feel like I was losing my mind. "Are you sure it's not a prank?" A prank. The thought would have been comforting if it weren't for the other signs. The shadows that seemed to linger just a second too long. The faint sounds at night that I could never quite place. Every empty text was a reminder, a whisper that whatever had invaded my home that night hadn't truly left. By the third month, the texts began to feel like a countdown. Each one brought a deeper sense of dread, as if they were marking time for something larger, something inevitable. One night I decided to reply. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed a single word. "Why?" I pressed send and waited, the silence in the room growing heavier with each passing second. My phone screen stayed dark, no notification, no acknowledgement of my question. But the air shifted, colder and sharper, and for a brief moment I swore I could hear the faintest whisper echoing through the room. It wasn't over. It was never over. The messages were just the beginning. Every creak in the floorboards feels like a warning. Every flicker of a shadow a threat. My home, once a sanctuary, has become a prison of uncertainty, each corner hiding a memory I would give anything to forget. I am living with a fear that doesn't sleep, one that wraps itself around me like a second skin, always there, always watching. After the messages began, life changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. It wasn't just the texts or the silence that followed them. It was the unshakable sensation that the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But the waiting was the worst part. I tried to move on. I went through the motions, cleaning the scratches from the office door, repainting the walls, and filling the house with noise just to drown out the oppressive silence. But the marks lingered in my mind, as permanent as if they had been etched into my skin. Every night brought the same ritual, checking and double-checking the locks, adjusting the thermostat, leaving every light on as though brightness alone could keep the darkness at bay. And yet, it was never enough. I could feel the cold creeping in, seeping through the cracks, a reminder of what had once been here and what might come back. I stopped inviting people over. How could I explain it? How could I tell them that every room felt like a trap, every hallway a stage for something unseen? My isolation became a necessity, a way to keep others safe from whatever had taken root here. The neighbors noticed. They asked questions I couldn't answer, their concerned glances lingering as I avoided their invitations and quickened my pace past their homes. It wasn't their fault, but I resented them for their normalcy, for their ignorance of the shadows that now haunted my life. Even my sleep became a battleground. The few hours I managed to steal were filled with dreams that twisted into nightmares, flashes of whispers and clawed handprints dragging me back into the darkness. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the digital clock on my nightstand always mocking me with its silent glow. And then there was Jackson, my 8-year-old nephew, who visited less and less. His mother told me he was afraid of my house now, afraid of the way the air felt too quiet, and the shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking. I couldn't blame him. I tried to sell the house, of course. The real estate agent, all smiles and promises at first, stopped calling back after the second showing. Prospective buyers whispered about the unsettling feeling they couldn't shake, about cold spots and strange noises they couldn't explain. The house wouldn't let me leave. I am tethered to it, trapped by something I can't see but can always feel. And even though the texts have grown less frequent, the fear remains constant. It's in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very foundation of this place. I don't know what it's waiting for, but I know it isn't over. Not yet. It's been 3 years since that night, but the questions it left behind feel as fresh as the scratches on my office door. Each day, I search for a meaning, a connection, something that can explain why my life was chosen to bear the weight of this unrelenting mystery. Yet, the only answers I've found are fragments, half-truths that vanish the moment I try to hold on to them. Living with the unknown has changed me. I've learned to move through life with one ear always attuned to the silence, one eye on the shadows. I've adapted to the constant edge of anticipation, a waiting game with an opponent I can't see and don't understand. The house is quiet now, but the quiet feels more like a threat than a reprieve. Somewhere out there, I believe someone knows the truth. Maybe it's another survivor, someone too afraid to speak, like I was for so long. Or perhaps it's the thing itself, hiding in plain sight, watching as I fumble in the dark. I'm sharing my story now because I can't be the only one who feels this. I can't be the only one who knows what it's like to live in a place where time stops, where shadows twist, and where silence is louder than any scream. Detective Martinez's words still haunt me. It's deliberate, too specific to be random. If there's a pattern, there has to be a reason. And if there's a reason, maybe there's a way to stop it. To those who've felt the same cold, heard the same whispers, and seen the same impossible things, I need you to come forward. Not for me, but for all of us. For those who haven't experienced it yet, for the ones who might be next. Because the truth is, whatever this is, it's still out there, and it's only a matter of time before it strikes again. So if you're reading this, and you know something, anything, don't stay silent. The shadows thrive on silence, and we can't let them win.